The night falls heavy, and the world outside is nothing but ice and silence. The fire in Hugues's hearth flickers low, each spark a tiny soldier fighting a war it cannot win. The wind prowls the village like a hungry wolf, pushing through cracks, rattling doors, searching for weakness. For a medieval peasant, winter was never a season, it was an enemy. One mistake, and frostbite or hunger would decide the ending. No central heating, no modern gear, just dirt walls, straw roofs, and the will to outsmart the cold. But here's the secret: Hugues and his neighbors weren't helpless. They had tricks, clever, stubborn, and surprisingly effective. 7 hacks that turned frozen huts into livable homes. Tonight, we're going to dig them up, one by one. And by the end, you might wonder, are we really more advanced today or just more spoiled? Snow piled high against the door, pushing inward, as if the storm itself wanted entry. Inside, the air was already turning cold. Every breath from Hugues and his family rose like smoke and vanished into the dark. The last bundle of firewood sat by the hearth, too small to last till dawn. He could hear the wind clawing at the thatch above, each gust spraying fine dust down onto the floor. This was the reality of a medieval winter night. Hunger rumbling in empty stomachs, frost creeping through walls, and the fear that the fire would die before the morning bell. The church bells that once called for prayer now marked survival. Would you live to hear them ring again? For peasants like Hugues, the cold was not background weather. It was the battlefield, and only those with clever tricks stood a chance of seeing tomorrow's light. And so, with the storm howling outside and the firewood nearly gone, Hugues reached for an old trick one that turned simple stones into lifesavers. Hugues wanted one thing: to close his eyes at night and wake up still breathing by dawn. The wind outside howled like wolves. Inside, the hut smelled of damp straw and smoke. But the fire would never last till morning. Once the flames died, the cold crept in. Slowly, relentlessly, his breath froze in the air. So he bent down by the hearth, picked round stones from the riverbank, heavy, smooth, gray. He laid them in the coals, watching sparks leap. The rocks cracked softly, almost like bread crust breaking. When they glowed faintly red, he rolled them out with an iron hook, wrapped them in coarse linen, and tucked them under the sleeping furs. The warmth seeped out slow, not fire-hot, but steady, like a hidden sun. Science says stone has high specific heat. It stores energy, then releases it gradually. Archaeologists have found traces of this trick in Norse farmsteads and even Roman bathhouses, proof it wasn't luck, but knowledge passed down. Think of it as a medieval hot water bottle, or maybe the world's first rechargeable heat battery. No plug, no warranty, just earth fire and patience. Modern campers carry power banks. Hugues, his power bank was a rock. Cheaper, though you can't scroll Instagram on it. So here's my question for you. If you were stuck in a winter hut with no heater, would you trust a stone to keep you alive? Drop your answer. I'm curious who'd say yes, and who'd just move south. Hugues dreamed of something simple: to lie down after a day of labor and not feel the earth steal the warmth from his bones. But the ground was merciless, frozen hard as iron, damp as a cellar. The cold crept up from below, slow and cruel, until even thick blankets were useless. So he gathered what the field offered: straw, piles of it smelling of sun and soil. He spread it across the floor layer after layer, the dry stalks whispering under his boots. Then he pressed it down, covered it with hides, and lay on top. The sound was soft, like walking on parchment. The smell warm, grassy, faintly sweet. And under him, no more icy grip from the earth, just a cushion that trapped air and held it still. That's the science. Still air is the best insulator. Archaeologists found traces of straw layers beneath medieval bedding in Scandinavian huts, even written mentions in 13th century farm accounts. Proof that peasants didn't just suffer through winter, they engineered it. Think of it like a medieval version of a sleeping pad. Today, you buy foam mats at REI. Back then, Hugues used whatever the land gave. Cost him nothing. except maybe a sneeze or two. Modern campers complain if they forget their inflatable pad. Hugues. He would laugh. His mattress squeaked, smelled like hay, and probably hosted a mouse or two, but it kept him alive. So tell me, if you had to choose between a $200 ultralight mat and a pile of free straw, which one would you trust on a frozen night? At the end of a bitter day, Hugues wanted nothing more than to climb into bed and feel safe. Not from wolves, not from thieves, but from the cold. A bed should be a refuge, right? The problem was his room was like a barn. Drafts slid through every crack, and the fire's warmth vanished before it reached the far corner. Lying on the bed felt like trying to sleep in the middle of a wind tunnel. So Hugues built walls within walls. He draped heavy cloth wool blankets, even patched together scraps around his bed frame. 4 post ropes strung across fabric hanging down. When he stepped inside, it was like crawling into a private tent. The air trapped in that little pocket warmed quickly, holding the heat from his own breath. The fabric muffled sound smelled faintly of smoke and lanolin and turned his bed into a cocoon. Here's the science convection steals heat when air keeps moving. By blocking the draft and trapping still air, those curtains worked like a thermal barrier. Medieval illustrations from the 14th and 15th centuries show beds with thick drapes, proof it wasn't just luxury, it was survival engineering. Modern campers do the same thing, set up a tarp inside a bigger tent to shrink the space. Hugues had his medieval microclimate. Today we call it glamping. Sure, his curtains probably looked more like a patchwork quilt than a luxury suite. But hey, better to smell like sheep's wool than freeze like an icicle. So let me ask you, if you had to face a freezing draft tonight, would you pick Hugues' medieval curtain hack or crank up your thermostat? Drop your answer. I'm curious. One autumn evening, Hugues stood outside his cottage watching the first frost glisten on the fields. He wanted a warm winter one where his family could sit by the hearth without shivering every time the north wind howled. But his thatched roof-woven bundles of rye straw was like a giant flute. The wind blew right through, turning the house into a drafty whistle. Warm air escaped, cold air rushed in. No matter how hard the fire burned, the roof betrayed him. So Hugues grabbed a wooden pail, scooped clay and mud from the riverbank, and smeared it thick across the thatch. With his bare hands and a flat stick, he pressed it into every gap. The smell of wet earth filled the air, the straw creaked under the weight, and slowly the golden roof turned into a brown crust. Once winter came, that clay hardened like armor, blocking wind and even shedding snow. Science explains that simply still air is insulation, but only if the wind doesn't punch through. The clay layer sealed those micro gaps, cutting convective heat loss. Archaeological studies in Germany and Britain show that medieval villagers often patched thatch with mud or daub, creating a weatherproof coating. Think of it as medieval spray foam. Except instead of a hardware store, you had mud patience and really cold fingers. And let's be honest, his roof wasn't winning any beauty contests. But it kept the family warm, and at night, no one cared what it looked like. Better an ugly roof than an icy coffin. So if your roof started whistling like a flute in a storm, would you run to Home Depot? Or to the nearest mud pit, like Hugues' drop? Your answer I'm dying to know. One winter night, Hugues dreamed of nothing more than waking up warm without frost clinging to his beard. He wanted his cottage to feel like a cocoon, safe from the midnight chill. But the truth stone floors sucked the warmth out of his bones. The fire in the hearth roared, yet the ground beneath him felt like sleeping on a block of ice. No blanket could fight that cold creeping up from below. So he tried a trick as old as the Romans. Hugues dug shallow pits beneath the floor and filled them with glowing embers from last night's fire. He shoveled the coals carefully, the smell of char and pine resin rising into the room. Then he covered the pits with flat stones and a layer of packed earth. The floor warmed slowly like a hidden stove under his bed of straw. Science backs him up. Embers release heat steadily for hours, and the soil acts as thermal mass, absorbing energy and radiating it upward. Archaeologists have found similar systems in medieval monasteries and Viking houses, where subfloor heating kept the living space survivable through endless winters. In modern terms, think of it as radiant floor heating. Only instead of PEX tubing and a thermostat, you've got dirt rocks and a man with a shovel. Was it safe? Hey, sometimes the floor smoked, sometimes it didn't. Let's just say medieval OSHA wasn't around. But it worked, and that was all that mattered. Now I've got to ask, if you had the choice between a medieval ember pit and your fancy heated floors, which would you trust on a blizzard night? Drop your answer. I'm curious which team you're on. Hugues often wished his little stone cottage could hold warmth the way a loaf holds heat fresh from the oven. He wanted to rise in the morning without feeling like his bones had been left in the icebox all night. But winter in the Pyrenees had other plans. The wind moaned through cracks, the floor stayed cold, and every step on the stones bit up through his bare feet. No matter how big the fire roared, the warmth just curled at the hearth and died before reaching the rest of the house. That's when Hugues remembered the monks of Reichenau Abbey, rumored to have built channels beneath their floors in the 9th century. So with shovel in hand, he carved shallow tunnels in the packed earth, lining them with stones. Each evening he dragged glowing coals from the hearth and raked them into these underfloor channels. The air hissed, the stones crackled, and soon the whole floor radiated a gentle heat, spreading warmth across the room like invisible fingers. Science agrees this was an early form of radiant floor heating. Heat from the coals traveled through the channels, warming the stones, which in turn radiated energy upward. Efficiency. Nearly 90% not bad for a guy with a shovel instead of a thermostat. Archaeologists have confirmed such systems in monasteries, castles, even some Roman bathhouses that outlived the empire. Modern comparison. Think of it as underfloor heating without the plumber's bill. Sure, today you've got PEX tubing boilers and thermostats. Hugues had dirt smoke and hope. And the punchline. If you've ever complained about your heating bill, imagine telling Hugues you spend hundreds of dollars a month just to avoid what he solved with a hole in the dirt. He'd probably laugh, then ask to borrow your slippers. So what do you think? Would you trust a medieval ember channel under your bed or stick with modern radiant floors? Drop a comment. I want to know whose team Dirt Tech and whose team Smart Thermostat. On the coldest nights, Hugues didn't dream of riches or fine meals or even a softer bed. All he wished for was warmth that lasted till dawn. But a single fire in his small cottage wasn't enough. The wind clawed at the shutters, the hearth burned out too fast, and the night stretched long and merciless. Even the sheep gave up and huddled close, shivering beside him. That's when the village turned to an old survival trick, communal heat sharing. In the center of town, neighbors dug a large pit lined with stones. Each evening, men carried glowing logs and coals from their hearths, piling them into the pit until it roared like a dragon's mouth. Children fetched bundles of straw. Women dragged broken branches. Everyone contributed. The fire burned low through the night, and the heated stones radiated warmth long after the flames died. Families gathered around sharing stories, passing bread, and sometimes simply sleeping close to the pit. Science behind it. Think of it as thermal mass on a community scale. Stones storing heat bodies clustering together to reduce heat loss air currents, slowed by walls of straw bales or woven hurdles. Archaeologists have found traces of such communal fire pits in medieval villages and monasteries, where collective heating was not just efficient, it was survival. Modern comparison. It's like a neighborhood BBQ mixed with a giant outdoor space heater, only instead of grilling burgers, you're grilling the winter itself. And here's the punchline today. We complain when the Wi-Fi signal doesn't reach the back bedroom. Back then, Hugues worried if the fire's warmth reached his toes. Different priorities, same frustration. So here's my question for you. Would you give up your thermostat for one night to sit by a medieval village fire pit swapping stories with strangers just to stay alive? Comment below. I'm curious who's brave enough to join the circle. And so, 7 humble tricks carried Hugues through another winter. From straw floors to ember pits, from hidden channels to village fire circles, each hack was less about comfort and more about survival. Imagine waking up, not to the sound of an alarm clock, but to frost clinging on the walls, your breath hanging like smoke. For medieval peasants, warmth wasn't a luxury. It was the difference between another sunrise or none at all. What strikes me most is how resourceful they were. No thermostats, no fleece jackets, no electric blankets, just dirt, stone, straw, and a stubborn will to see the morning. That's medieval survival in its purest form. Now I'll turn it to you. Which of these heating hacks surprised you most? Drop your answer below, and if you'd face winter the medieval way, hit subscribe because the next storm might come sooner than you think.